Okay, so the topic is the four foundations of mindfulness. And so there's these four foundations of mindfulness, and the Buddha is describing a way to contemplate about each of the four foundations. And my question is, how does it all link together? And more specifically, what I mean is the Buddha is talking about contemplations about the body. And then he provides an explanation about the foulness of the body, going to a graveyard. And then the second one, he starts to talk about feeling and mind objects. And my question is, are these like quote unquote independent objects of mindfulness? In other words, if a mind has a lot of sense desire or sensual desire, then it's recommended to do the meditation on the foulness of the body, meaning the object of meditation is the foulness of the body, and one starts to actively incline to contemplate about it. Or is it that almost like a second way of meditation, that one just sees whatever is coming up, and whatever is coming up is to be to let go of. So it's almost like a question about in parallel or serial. I don't know if my question makes a little bit sense, but I'm just thinking about the four foundations of mindfulness in a way of actively practicing it in terms of developing one's own mind.
Yeah. So you go back to the Satipatthana Sutta and you look at it. It's quite interesting in the progression or the choice the Buddha made in terms of how he selects what to choose. So he has the broad categories of the body itself, then the feeling, then the mind, and then phenomena. And that's internal mental phenomena and external phenomena like the five aggregates and other things and so on. So what's happening is he's going subtler and subtler as you're going through it. So the very first thing that you can notice is the body. And you can look at the different practices he mentions in any of the foundations of mindfulness as being meditation objects. So these are recommendations based on a person's mindset, based on a person's level of understanding, as well as what their mind is more prone towards. So if the mind, for example, as you mentioned, if the mind is more prone towards having a lustful nature, meaning more attached to sensory experiences, and identifies very strongly with the body, which the Buddha actually recommended to Rahula, his own son, when he asked him the question regarding the mindfulness of the breath and so on. And first he said to look at the body and look at the body as the four great elements, look at the body as the foulness of the body and so on, because he understood that Rahula's mind had at that point in time a lot of craving for bodily sensations and experiences. So if you look at, for example, mindfulness of the body, the Buddha has a few different contemplations within it. He starts off with mindfulness of the breath. And breath here is an anchor point to stay in the present moment. It's a way of understanding how mind drifts away from its attention of keeping it on the breath. So that is So mindfulness in general should be understood as, number one, seeing how mind's attention moves. So how the mind drifts away from what one has initially applied the mind towards. So that initial application is the beginning of mindfulness. So that's a small component, but a pretty large one when you look into the factor of the whole meditation. But you need to have an object. And then the mindfulness is about seeing if mind becomes distracted or not, and what kind of distractions arising is then investigation and so on. So mindfulness is always the beginning. So mindfulness of the breath, he starts off with, and then he talks about looking at the body as the four great elements, or looking at the different parts of the body, and then realizing in that sense, seeing the arising and passing away of that. So with the breathing, you see the arising and passing of the breathing with inhalation and exhalation, for example. But while you're doing it, you're relaxing the tranquilization. You're tranquilizing the formation. So it's a relaxation or tranquilization of formations as you start to come into a more collected state of mind. So there are different practices, but the best would be to understand it from the context of seeing, in the example of breathing, how the mind starts to become more collected and starts to bring up the enlightenment factors. There's a whole sutta dedicated to that in the Anapanasati Sutta, where then from the breath as a reminder, the jump is then made into seeing the factors of enlightenment being aroused as one becomes mindful of sensations and different parts of the body and so on. So it's not a matter of necessarily taking one just as an object either, but it can start off that way. So if a person has a mind that is very restless or agitated and speculative, that's usually the word they use in the tradition, which is a mind that is always investigating, always looking for answers. The breath is indicated as a remedy for that because it's just one standard thing, inhaling and exhaling. But there's no control of the breath, it's just watching it. By doing that, you're basically letting go of your attention on restless thoughts and agitation. So that's a good remedy for that. When it comes to seeing the different aspects of the body, looking at the different elements that make up the body, and then of course the contemplation of a corpse, it really is a very strong remedy towards lust and craving for the body. In fact, in the ancient traditions, during the Buddha's time and sometime after, a monk would actually go to the charnel grounds. I mean, this was the exercise. They would go to the cemetery or the place where they would cremate the bodies, usually around near the river, the Ganges River and whatnot. But they would go to a charnel grounds and they would spend time there looking at the different uh, progress of deterioration in the body. And that really kind of shocks the senses, just seeing it and then realizing that this body is of that same nature. That really pulls away this identification with the body and pulls away with this desire for fulfilling the cravings of the body. So these are all considered as remedies. Now, when you look at sensations or feeling, the mindfulness of feeling, it's referring to the mindfulness of feeling in terms of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral in relation to sensory experiences as well. Now, it might not seem that way, but that's the one way you understand feeling is how does feeling arise? Feeling is born from contact with one or more of the six sense bases. So you pay attention to the perception of that feeling and notice using that sensation or sensory experience as an anchor point to come to the present moment. So any of the contemplations, now when you go into the mind itself, you're looking at how the mind moves from feeling to consciousness to formations and so on. And then phenomena is in relation to paying attention to the enlightenment factors, paying attention of the hindrances that are arising, paying attention to the rise and fall of the aggregates, and of course the Four Noble Truths, seeing how the Four Noble Truths are applied when you practice right effort or when you practice the 6R process. So mindfulness is really most viable or best applied for one subject at a time, and it can come up in one moment as mindfulness of the body, and in another moment come up with mindfulness of the mind or mindfulness of sensations. Now, that doesn't mean that the mind is drifting from place to place, and meaning the mind is drifting place to place without one's attention. Rather, one is allowing the mind to just do what it's doing while paying attention to where the mind is moving. So mindfulness or the foundations of mindfulness as an exercise as a whole is to be able to come into that observation state where you're not placing your attention on an object, but you're just purely looking at how the attention moves. And when you do that, what's actually happening is you're going into the present moment as it's flowing from one now to another moment to another moment. And so all you're really watching is how the attention moves. And then at a certain point, and this is the refrain that Buddha uses for each end of one foundation of mindfulness, which is watching the arising and passing away. So what you're watching is also the arising and passing away of the attention from one object to another as the moments flow, and then doing so without any craving or aversion being present. Now, which means that whatever you're watching is totally uninvolved. You're watching like a impersonal scientist, so to speak, like watching through a microscope or through a telescope and just observing. And as you're observing, or as the mind is observing, what happens is the mind might have a tendency to involve a sense of self to what it's watching. So if when you're watching thoughts, or when you're watching the mind is watching the body walking or waking up, or just sitting down or eating, it's not watching the posture of the body. It's not watching the eating sensation of the body, or it's not watching the sensation of taste, although it can be, but it's also watching how the mind responds to these things, watching how the mind's attention moves from that to there based on whether there is craving or aversion present. That's why the Buddha in that refrain also says, without any craving or aversion for the world. And that's really about, in reference to having this complete neutral, completely impersonal observation of what is arising and passing away.
So a couple of follow-up questions. So then the foundness of the body, and actually the whole body contemplation and the way Buddha is describing it, in my mind, that's like an active contemplation on the foundness of the body. And as a result, I would state that it's only possible to do that while in the first jhana and not higher, because if you would go higher, you actually lose the active contemplation element. Is that a correct statement?
Yes, insofar as when the mind is looking at the bodily contemplation, there will be active thinking processes involved because it's contemplating one thing after another. So to that extent, there will be still other factors present, not all of them. Like there will be mindfulness, there will be investigation or understanding, there will be energy and effort. There might be even joy because of the release from the craving related to it. There can be tranquility after that, and collectedness because you're watching it with such a mind. And there can be equanimity because the mind becomes undisturbed by seeing it, not having aversion on it either. So when all of these factors come to play and there is balance there, then the mind is said to be in jhana. So to that extent, if one is contemplating in this manner, where once starting with the mindfulness, it naturally progresses through these different factors, one is said to be, yes, in the first jhana. And you cannot be beyond that because there is still active mental activity in terms of vitakka and vichara. Vitakka being the initial application of thought, and vichara being that sustained application of thought. So that contemplation involves those two elements. So it can be rightly said that one doesn't go beyond the first jhana.
And then the watching of the arising and passing away of any of these elements, is that what the Buddha refers to as a non-application? Meaning, there's basically no object of mind's attention, and the inclination of mind is just to let go of everything that arises in order to develop wisdom. Is that correct?
Yeah. So we can look at this from the context of the higher jhanas, especially once one takes quiet mind as the object, mind watching itself, so to speak. So just watching the mind, and there is no perception. And then when their formations arise, they're not as clear, but then mind just immediately releases and relaxes and returns back to quiet mind. There is even a subtler state than that, which is the signless state. So it can happen in the quiet mind, but the signless state is the fruition of not taking anything as an object because of that very deep insight into impermanence. And that deep insight into impermanence is by watching the arising and passing away of whatever phenomena arises and passes away without any involvement, without taking that itself also as an object. In doing so, one sees there is no stable object to take into account because all objects then are impermanent. And the attention to that is ultimately also impermanent. It's all conditioned. So because of that, the mind is uninclined to take anything as an object. And that undirectedness of mind is also where there is there is the understanding that taking anything as an object can cause craving, can cause the potential for the mind to identify with that object. That's why there is the uninclined mind as well. So there is the signless mind in seeing the arising and passing away. There is the uninclined mind in seeing that this can cause suffering if the mind identifies with it. So there's no direction given to the mind in that sense. And there is the emptiness part of that. So the emptiness or void is in relation to seeing that there is no controller there, that there is no personal self there. So the mind doesn't identify with anything. These three are really the what they call the gateways to liberation, because what happens even upon contact with the nibbana element is the same thing, where the mind doesn't have any object that it takes as its uh, as its object of attention, because when the links arise, the mind just becomes uninvolved in it. It doesn't take any link and attaches a sense of self there, identifies with it. And because of that uninclined nature of seeing that there is uh, no point in taking something as a process of identification because it will cause suffering, it remains uninclined, uninvolved in that. And then, of course, the not self aspect. So, Nibbana being not self as well, it doesn't attach any conceit to any of those things. So, a mind that is, if one wants to, let's say, train in the mind that is signless, in the mind that is uninclined, and in the mind that is empty, there are a few ways of doing it. The four foundations of mindfulness are a wonderful practice, particularly within that, the understanding of the five aggregates. Seeing the aggregates arise and pass away. So the mind's attention moves from, for example, a sensation that happens within the body, or seeing something and one sees that as not self. Phenomena that arise and pass away, one sees as not self and doesn't get become inclined towards that. What happens is the mind becomes so collected from that, not taking anything personal, not taking anything as self, and not taking anything as permanent. It just starts to settle into itself, it, so to speak. The mind just settles within that awareness, if you will, or attention to seeing that. So the fruition of seeing the arising and passing away being impermanent, the fruition of seeing that as not worth holding onto and therefore having no inclination, and the fruition of seeing that as not self is the mind that naturally rests within itself. So if there's any effort to be made there, it's in just allowing the mind to see it, deepen its understanding of it, and then ultimately let go quite naturally so that it just is comfortable with its own self.
when one does start such a meditation, do you generate the intention to let go of all the phenomena which are arising and the intention to actually just watch and with that develop wisdom?
Yeah, you have the intention of letting go insofar as whenever you see that the mind holds on to something. So in the initial part of the exercise, so to speak, is just to watch it. No inclination, no intention to do anything but to watch. And only when the mind starts to hold on to something is when you use the process of a little bit of energy or effort to let go of that as a potential for craving to arise. When you see it, or when the mind sees it, it automatically lets it go, and then comes back to itself and continues to watch it. Eventually, the seeing of arising and passing away, whether it's five aggregates, whether it's the foundations of mindfulness, whether it's consciousness arising and passing away, whatever it might be, it all rests ultimately into that nothingness. So the fruition of that is the nothingness, as we understand it in the seventh jhana, in the plane of nothingness, where now the mind is uninclined towards external factors. It's no more interested in sensory activation, no more interested in sensory experience. And anything that does arise at that point are mental formations of internal mind feeling, or mental feeling and mental perception. So when one sees this, one has the notion or the understanding of letting that go as well. That's where then it deepens further into the eight jhana. So if there's anything new there, is just to watch. And then after a while, when the mind does start to hold on to something or drifts away, that's when one releases and lets go, relaxes, and comes back. So that is the only activity, only intention and action that's done, only when that happens. Otherwise, there's just pure seeing without any will.
And then moving on from the seventh jhana into neither perception or non-perception and the signless states. And ultimately, when the final formation has been let go into cessation, there's this talk about the cessation of feeling and perception. And at the same time, there is feeling, perception, and consciousness being conjoined. So the cessation of feeling and perception is basically the cessation of feeling, perception, and consciousness.
Yes. So the cessation of perception and feeling is also the cessation of consciousness, because consciousness arises dependent upon some kind of feeling. So there is, for example, the eye consciousness, the ear consciousness, the nose consciousness, the tongue consciousness, the body consciousness, and the mind consciousness. But there is also the external aspect of that, which is the form consciousness or light consciousness, seeing things. So there's the form consciousness. There is the sound consciousness, the taste consciousness, the smell consciousness, the touch consciousness, and the thought consciousness. There's also the consciousness dependent upon the actual seeing. So there is the awareness that there is seeing going on. There is the awareness that there's hearing going on, and so on and so forth. So when there's no feeling at all, there's also no perception, because these two are conjoined. Perception being the naming of whether that is an experience, and if that experience is there, whether it's pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, and so on. You know, if I see a tree, I know it's green, it's got the stems, it's got the bark, and all of that. So that perception also disappears when there's no feeling. So when the final formations do pass away and there is complete silence, let's say, there's no feeling there. Since there's no feeling there, there's no perception. But then also, because there's a consciousness that arises dependent upon that feeling, specifically what one can call feeling consciousness. So really there is a dyad, as is explained in the tradition, but it's actually a triad if you look at it. Just to say, there is the I, let's just take the example of the I. There's the I consciousness, and there is the form consciousness, and there is the seeing consciousness. So in the mind, now in the meditation, the mind only has thinking or certain formations that cause certain mental processes to arise. So in that, there is the mind, and there is mind consciousness. There is the mind object and mind object consciousness. And there is the joining of the two, where there is consciousness of that as well. So that if you call it thinking, for example, or if you call it imagining, or whatever you want to call it, there's a consciousness that is dependent upon that thinking and that imagining. Because all of that disappears, so do all of the consciousnesses that are dependent upon that.
And then the Buddha talks about the difference between a bhikkhu in cessation of feeling and perception and a being that has dissipated all the five aggregates and is dead. And one of the differences being described is the sense faculty themselves, whereas in a bhikkhu which is in the cessation of feeling and perception, the sense faculties are bright. And the sense faculty may be bright, but they are not attended to because there's no consciousness. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. So what is that meaning, actually, bright? You know, that's one of the things that people often wonder about. So in the case of one where it's the vitality has left, where there is death, it's a corpse. It's said to be it's said in some ways as the senses are impaired, or there is just no activity in the senses. But if you look at in the case of cessation of perception and feeling, what it is there is no activity in the senses, and therefore there is no defilement, meaning the senses are bright. So using the analogy of the luminous mind that the Buddha talks about, that the mind is luminous, but there are defilements. And what are these defilements? They are specifically related to the taints, but then they extend on into the fettered formations and the feeling and perception and so on. But here the faculties are bright, not because there is a sensation of brightness or because there is a sensation of radiance, but they are bright because they are not being impeded constantly by activity. So they're clear. There's no running water going through them. Running water being the sensations. It's just non-active and therefore calm, collected, and bright.
Okay, thank you. And then the next step, so a mind that's coming out of the cessation experience and where there is a formation that is arising, and the formation can arise in one's mind which has achieved the third stage of awakening, where basically the timing, quote unquote, can be set by the initial inclination into the mind.
Mm-hmm.
More specifically, so one can develop the mind in such a way that after 5 minutes, mind can come out of the cessation state, and that will generate a certain formation.
Yeah.
And then basically the process starts up again, and the senses are attended to, but nothing is being taken personal because one is seeing the impersonal nature of all the formations.
Right. So if we look at the intention is sort of what keeps the mind, or gives the ability of the mind to come back up. So up until 6 days or 7 days, or up until 5 minutes or 10 minutes, and so on, there is an internal mechanism which is related to, let's say, the body clock in modern terminology. So whatever that might be is what it might be. So in the case of like the ancient days, they didn't really have the concept of minutes and seconds and all of that, but they had the concept of saying something like, may this mind be there for half a day or a quarter of a day, or the first watch of the night, or whatever it might be, a different way of understanding time. And they also added to that, if one was a bhikkhu, that if the master called, then the mind would come back up, so that they can tend to, for example, the Buddha calling that bhikkhu, or if a bhikkhu needed help, or whatever it might be, or if there was a fire nearby or danger nearby, and so on. So, which means that the senses, as we just mentioned, are unimpaired. They are not active, but they are open. They're open enough to know or understand if the sound of a bhikkhu arises, that it turns the mind back on, or if the sensation of warmth, of fire or something, or the mental understanding that there's fire around arises, it wakes the mind up, so to speak. It will create the circumstances for the mind to reboot back up, and then that mind is still clear, meaning it still is not attending to any of the links or anything like that. But when the sensation does arise, as you mentioned, the third stage of awakening, there's still this identity there. So there is this, I am seeing this, or I am hearing this, or I sense a fire, or I can hear the Buddha calling at that point, Buddha was there, or I can hear somebody calling, and so on. So there is still an identification process going on, but there is no craving present, which means there's no satisfaction or dissatisfaction based on that experience of the senses.
And then back to the beginning of the meditation. So when one starts a meditation and one wants to develop the mind for a certain quality to develop, either it be the enlightenment factors, be it the psychic powers, be it the timing in the mind. So that's an active inclination that one makes prior to the meditation, which is not to be identified with. So, for example, may mind develop in such a way, or may mind be in the first jhana for 5 minutes, as an example, and then this will be developed in such a way that the starting point is 8 minutes and it's 2 minutes, and in the end, mind converges on this 5-minute interval. Is that the way it works?
Yeah, so if we link with the other question that you asked just before this, and talk about this as well, the one part I did not mention, and one ought to understand from the mechanics of this whole process, is formations. So the intention drives forward those formations. So if there's an intention that the mind will be in cessation for so and so long and then come out, it's also the formations that arise based on the mind arising. So, for example, the formations that will arise if someone intended that may the mind be in this state for 5 minutes, or arise or emerge if someone is calling, if Buddha is calling, or if there's a fire. So a formation has been basically planted within the mind, so to speak, through one's intention. You see, the thing about intention is it drives formations forward, so that whatever formations arose previously are then manifested and taken fruit into a feeling or sensation or expression of speech or whatever it might be, but it also conditions formations, the next set of formations. So intention, just like formations are the carrier of karma, the intention is karma itself, active and passive. So intentions drive forward the passive and they also activate the next set of formations. So you have the intention, or one person has an intention of saying that the mind will be in one jhana for 5 minutes. This is an intention that ultimately activates a certain type of formation. And once that process is perfected, those formations are embedded in the mind to that point where anytime there is the intention of being there for 5 minutes, it will be spot on for 5 minutes or whatever the time limit is. So this is dependent upon intention and formations and the interconnection between the two.
All is intertwined basically in the sense that once one generates the intention, it creates the formation. And in case the Buddha is calling the bhikkhu, then the formation is firing, but just because the formation is firing, the consciousness is firing, the materiality, mentality, and the sense bases are attended to, and one can basically boot up the mind, so to speak. And in terms of the active intention, it creates the new formation, which creates the intention after 5 minutes, and then the whole circle is of dependent origination is basically completed.
Yes. Yes.
That's it, Delson, for me. Thank you.
Stop the recording.